The reason that I've focused so much on things like awe, wonder, beauty, grace is by holding on to those things, it's kept me sane because you're remembering the best of the world, the natural world around us and awe and so on, but you're also remembering the best of what it is to be human.
I loved your biography of Queen Victoria, and then I was like, because I was going to write about Queen Elizabeth in my discipline book, the second.
Oh, yeah,
and I
yeah.
was like, there's got to be a book this good about her, and there wasn't.
Right, yeah.
Maybe we're just too close to her. There were, I don't know, I couldn't.
Well,
she was still alive, but there. Yeah, it's pretty good.
Smith's.
It was okay.
It wasn't okay. Is she too close to it? Maybe
I don't know. I didn't. She was treating her. I felt she treated her more as a pop culture figure than a historical figure.
Right.
So there was like a breeziness and a gossipiness to it, and not like a weight to it, which Queen Victoria was very interesting to me.
Yeah.
In that regard.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're very different books. Like, it's unusual, I think, that someone would do sort of serious, big, thick biography and then go into the books that you're doing now. Was that a deliberate
I'm going to go back
transition?
and do history next.
Who do you want to? Who are you going to do?
Well, actually Florence Nightingale. I want to do a year of her. I'm going to do a year of her life and weave in. It's kind of going to be a creative thing, but there's something I've been wanting to. I know you've written about her a little bit too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm forgetting who. Someone did an amazing biography of her.
Yeah, and I've forgotten his name too, but it was about 10.
No. There's a woman,
ago.
Cecil.
Cecil Woodham Smith.
Yes. Incredible biography.
Yeah. I agree. I loved her writing.
Yes.
Because she did also a 2-part biography of Victoria, but she died. She only did the first part.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And I was really inspired by her because she had written, I think it's like thrillers or some kind of like books before she'd written novels before she did that. So I tried to learn from her how to pace it. She was very good at pacing because you would go, wow, like even though you knew what was happening, you'd go through it. The potato famine she did a book on too.
She also wrote a book on the charge of the Light Brigade. That's incredible.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just called The Reason Why.
Oh, wow.
Because from the poem, like theirs is not to reason why. And it's like the reason why. And the reason why is there's no fucking reason. It's because...
It's the idiocy of the... Do you know what always strikes me about the Light Brigade? Do you know about these gentleman viewers? So when they would have their battles down on the plain and people would come from Britain to watch like it was a game, and they would set out their picnic blankets and they'd be like, ha, great move and rah, go team.
Yeah.
Like the grotesquerie of that as spectator sport has always struck me about those.
Well, the sort
Crimean
of
ones,
the bravery that they would charge into certain death, but didn't have the courage to say, should we charge into it? That's the paradox of that.
It's actually
charge.
Obedience.
Yes. Which you need.
Obedience to folly.
Yes.
Is also, it's both obedience and bravery.
Well, I talk about that when I talk to military leaders. There's this paradox, which like you think about what military culture is. It's about making everyone the same and think the same. It's about creating obedience, and it's creating camaraderie and creating a unit that's about the unit and not the individual.
Yeah.
And then you get thrust into a position of leadership where suddenly you have to make moral decisions, and you're expected to make the right moral decision and not just go along.
Yes.
And the tension of that, right? So there's this crazy part in The Reason Why where she talks about how after they get back, so like, the 600 does not come back, but there's like 200 that survive. There was an implicit assumption, and they start to wheel the horses around and regroup to go again.
Right.
Like, so not only did they do it the first time and not question it, then when it was obviously a mistake and they just watched everyone get slaughtered, the impulse is to like do it again.
Yeah.
And so like, how do you maintain your individuality and your ability to make rational choices inside this culture? That's the tension.
Yeah.
And the best leaders manage to somehow square that impossible circle.
Right.
But anyway, she was amazing.
Yeah.
She has a line in that Florence Nightingale book where, like, what I thought was so fascinating about Florence Nightingale is, like, her parents didn't want her to do it. Like,
the
the
urge in her. That's what I almost want to write about, that time when she was straining to go. What was in that?
Well, the hero's journey is the call to adventure. And then the second part of the hero's journey is the refusal of the call. Like that's part of it.
Yeah, right.
And the part of it for her is she refuses the call, not for like she hears this voice and it goes for a little while and then she ignores it. Not again, like we do, like, hey, I think I want to be a writer. I think I want to move, to another country, or I think I want to start a company. She ignores it for 8 years and she gets it again. Then she ignores it for 8. It takes her 16 years to take even the smallest tangible step towards doing this thing.
But think about all the sediment on top of her of cultural expectations, her sister's hysteria, her parents. And she had that lovely bloke who wanted to marry her who was quite poetic. Yeah. Like if she was going to marry, he probably would be great. She had to resist so much to do that.
Right, like her parents are basically, we'd rather you be a prostitute than a nurse.
Yeah,
like it was
considered pretty slutty to be a nurse then anyway. Yeah. So that's why she was so she tried to bring respectability to it.
Well, to me, one of the things I talked about her in the book I just did is like, there was this sense, I think what's so interesting about Victorian culture is how repeatedly there's sort of this triumph of hope over experience, just like, the firstborn should be in charge, even though it like never works out. Or like, both women should not go anywhere near a hospital. And then also a woman should automatically know how to take care of someone.
Right.
The idea that nursing or any kind of activism or helping of people required like competence and training. That's like her main innovation was like, no, nursing is a craft.
Profession.
And you have to understand it. And like this whole idea of do no harm was not like, was a literal thing. She was like, no, you make things worse. You're more likely to die under the care of a doctor than at home.
Right.
And her genius was to like actually figure out, not just have sympathy and affection for someone who's suffering, but like know what to do about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And she knew about things like the sight of green makes people better. Scientists have only really just discovered that in the last 20 years here.
Yeah.
Right? Like
or like, hey, we should let air into this building. We shouldn't have all these sick people sealed up in a brick building breathing each other's noxious germs.
Right.
But yeah, just it wasn't just at like some intuitive level, but she seemed to be willing to like look at the evidence and solve problems.
And from her bed, like when she was confined for so long, for many decades, she would write and say, look, I'm worried about what's happening to native populations in all the countries of the Commonwealth. Can you send me the statistics on who's dying and what they're dying from and da-da-da. And even though she has said things indicative of her time, she's problematic in that sense, that she was saying there is a disproportionate number of deaths of Aboriginal Australians. They need to be on their country. You're taking them away from their country. Things like this incredible insight.
Yeah.
Just because she was looking at the data from her bed in London.
Well, yeah, people, I think one of her aunts wrote this letter about how, the image, like there's the famous poem where she's the lady with the lamp that she's going from bedside to bedside. And she was saying like, what you're actually missing is like the letter writing and the studies and the accounting and the meetings, that she was this sort of bureaucratic and logistical genius.
Yes. She was the first one to really properly use the pie chart for persuasive means. That's right. But I feel that there's been this revision. So there's first is the gentle nurturer, the lady of the lamp. And then there's this absolutely, you read some accounts and it's like this, like A.N. Wilson and so on, this ferocious like dragon lady who killed men around her because she worked so hard and she worked them so hard. And so in between, there's a really interesting story.
Yeah, this fusing of sort of sympathy and empathy and care with very sharp competence and effectiveness and savvy is fascinating to me.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, and she'd pop up occasionally in Queen Victoria's diary. Like Nightingale would rock up at the castle having shaved her head because there was lice outbreak in the hotel in the hospital she was in, or just begging for more money. And she actually took Victoria and Albert very seriously. She thought they were serious people wanting to. I mean, obviously Albert was defined serious, but as opposed to the dilettantes and the aristocrats of the age who weren't interested in.
Well, I can't wait to read that. That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Well, so I put phosphorescence in. I'm doing a 10-year anniversary edition of The Obstacles Way, and I use one of your stories in it.
Oh, yeah, it's fun.
You talked about you're at your sort of lowest ebb. Talking to your therapist.
Oh yeah.
He says, "You want to tell that story?"
Yeah. And it's at this time that it counts. Everything you've ever taught, everything you've ever read, that thing.
Yeah, this is when you use it.
This is it, yeah.
What did that mean to you?
So I think that when the therapist says to me, this is it, it's that sense of like, stop flailing around and draw on not just what you've got innately within you, but all the wisdoms and all the things that you've been given and seen and been taught your whole life. And inside you, there's this reservoir, and pull on that. And I found that really like sobering in a good way.
Yeah.
It made me just stop and think and reflect and go, yeah, that's it. This is it. This is when you just get it together.
Yeah. What else were all those experiences for, if not leading you towards something?
Yeah. Even all those little, like, I know you keep a commonplace book.
Yeah.
Even all those little like collections of quotes you do and books you read and just wisdoms that you reflect on. That's it. Yes. What's the point of it all if you're not like finding yourself in just a whole pile of crap and trying to work a way out of it?
Yeah, to me, and that's to me what Stoicism is for the moments when life sort of kicks your ass or you find yourself overwhelmed. You're supposed to draw not just on your own experience and wisdoms, but also we have the benefit of the wisdom of so many people that came before us.
Right.
And how do you draw on that? And yeah, if you're not applying it, if it's not in this moment that you use this stuff, what was it all for?
Yeah, exactly. I like the idea that you have a reservoir too. You're actually building something inside you.
Yes.
That you're absorbing it, and you can use that.
I've been thinking about that because, the one thing we know about the future is that it's uncertain, right? But then I made it through the last 4 years, which were insane. And if you had asked most people at the beginning of 2020, hey, could you get through what the next year, the next 2 years, the next 3 years is, they would have said, that's insane. That's impossible. Right. And then you're here. And then what's weird is even having gone through that, then we still had that sort of low level or high level dread about the future, as if we haven't proved to ourselves like that we can get through things.
Right. I think one of the things that I wrestle with in my work as well is that if you talk about things like awe and wonder and things that sustain you, people often see that, you're just trying to distract yourself. It's like, you have a terrible diagnosis or someone you love, you've lost someone you love, just go and lie under a tree, go for a swim.
Yeah.
It's not about that. It's like we have got, it's not about distraction, it's about strength. Mm-hmm. We have just got so much to do individually, collectively, that you need to work out what makes you strong.
Yeah. And what are your off ramps for like extreme emotion? Like the idea that Stoicism is just the absence of emotion is impossible. Right. We know that's not healthy. Yeah. But if you have outlets for those things, or you have ways to process and evaluate and then sort of dissipate those emotions, then you cannot be destroyed by them.
Right.
That's kind of how I think about it.
Right.
Physical exercise is a thing like that. You have getting out into nature is a way to do that. What are the means by which you process the overwhelming amount of shit that life throws at you?
Yeah. And I think sometimes we're taught to infinitely burrow into ourselves.
Yeah.
In and in and in.
Yeah.
Self-reflect, have lots of smoothies, do all those things which are actually really good. But in and of themselves, I think we often forget how the importance of looking outwards, paying attention to the natural world, to the broader world, to the suffering of other people, just anyone around you in your circle. At any given point, there'll be people in your life who are dealing with stuff.
Yes.
Who need a hand. And I think often that can soothe you and strengthen you in a way that you don't anticipate when you go, okay, well, my own stuff is pretty crap, and by the end of today, it's still going to be like that, but I can go off and help someone else.
Yeah. Because when you were going through everything that you were going through, your family was also going through stuff at the same time, right?
With my mother?
Yeah.
Yeah. My brother was also in politics, and that was kind of a lot of high octane activity and criticism and all the rest of it. And my mother, and our whole family revolved around her. Like, she was just the light, the lamp of our family. And she had a progressive neurological disease that just eventually her body wouldn't respond to her anymore. It just wouldn't do what she said. We first worked it out when she was starting to have falls, but she couldn't clap. She couldn't clap her hands together. And then bit by bit, she couldn't walk. And then the worst thing was when she couldn't talk, and she would have to point things out with her fingers. And then we could still communicate that way. And then that hand went, her right hand, and then she would point it out with her left. And I remember when I realised her left was seizing, that was the point at which I probably really cried the most in her place of care. With my kids were with me, and I remember trying to push my chair backwards so she couldn't see me.
Yeah.
But I had just realised that's it. She's gone. I can't get any more words from her, and that's such a distressing thing. And a friend of mine came over yesterday and was talking about the Celine Dion documentary.
Yeah.
And she's got stiff person syndrome, and she said it reminded me of your mum. It's that thing of like your body just like twisting and just not doing what you're telling it to do. So yeah, that was there's a very particular kind of grief when someone is slipping away from you when they're still here that a lot of people deal with, and that was really hard. And then when I get sick myself, all I want to do is like curl up on my mum, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Physically, metaphorically, whatever. And we just kind of limped on together a bit.
How does that not just break you completely?
Because we still had each other, I think, and because that whole thing of like people go, why me? I've never actually even understood that, because why the person next to you? Why anyone else except for you?
Better?
Like,
Yeah.
I fundamentally don't understand that question. Why would you be exempt from everything? You can't work your way towards a life without suffering. You can do your best to avoid it, but it is on the whole kind of inevitable. But I think what I've written about, my mother had a very strong faith as well, and she struggled so much towards the end, but I know that she held on really tight to what was important to her and being surrounded by her family. And it meant a lot to my brothers and I to be curled up in the room next to her on the night that she died. And it was one of those nights where we're listening for her breath, because you're waiting for those last, you can tell, you know, for the last fully drawn breath, you get the rattle. And we were sitting there and sitting all around her and like talking, and then the staff kept bringing us more wine. I don't know where they had it from.
In the hospital?
in the aged care home. And so we were drinking, and then we were laughing about like being kids, and then we were with her, and then we were all, my brothers were on the floor and I was curled up on a chair next to my mum, and my head was right next to her. And my brother suddenly woke up, like just as she was about to take her last breath, and was like pulling on our toes, goes, guys, wake up. And we're all standing, leaning over her, and she took her last breath, and she was obviously very, very still and starting to cool. But the three of us standing there around her, I felt like we had walked her as far as we could go to the end of the earth, and the last thing she would have heard was the laughter and the love of her children.
Yeah.
Just as we were crying now. So those are the things that sustain you. Like, you can't say, my mother gave me so much love and wisdom through her life, to say then when she died that I couldn't go on would almost betray everything she'd ever taught and given me. Going back to what we were talking about before. And with my own thing, my own cancer and poor health, I think it's been, as I've written about these, I think the reason that I've focused so much on things like awe, wonder, beauty, grace, is by holding on to those things, it's kept me sane, because you're remembering the best of the world, the natural world around us, and awe and so on, but you're also remembering the best of what it is to be human.
Yeah, there's an American poet named William Stafford, and he tells a story about, he has adult children, they're all home, and, you know, it's like Thanksgiving or Christmas or something, and you know, he and his wife go to bed, and the kids stay up, and they're hanging out in the living room or the dining room table, just talking until, like, you know, late at night. And he's laying in bed with his wife, and he says to her, "This is the eulogy that we get to hear." Mm-hmm. You know, like your kids being together, your house being full.
Yes, that's it.
That sort of last moment.
Yeah.
Everything that comes after is for everyone else, but those moments where you're together and there's connection. Or sort of we think of awe as simply being, like a bird or something in the water or like some natural phenomenon. Yeah, but it's also moments
those
like that.
Moments, yeah. I mean, it's also music and art and anything that kind of can stop you in your tracks.
Yeah.
And make you think and marvel a little bit.
Yeah.
But there is a sense of awe in love. Like that's what you're describing.
Yes.
In that family setting.
Yeah. The unspoken communication, the sense that he woke up exactly before, there's just, there's something mystical and mysterious.
Yeah.
And as much a phenomena as flight or, a flower.
Yeah.
There's something to that, I think.
I agree. And it's also like everything.
Yeah. It's funny, like obviously the ancient world was full of death and they become sort of inured to it, but some of the most beautiful writings from the Stoics, Seneca writes these essays on grief. They survived to us. They're called consolations. He writes these letters. And I sort of reread them whenever someone I care about passes on. And one of the passages I think about all the time, he's writing to this woman who lost her father and who he had known. And he was saying, wherever your father is now, what would he want his memory to invoke in you?
Yeah.
Like obviously when you die, it would be weird if nobody missed you. Yeah. But like if your memory filled people with sadness and anguish and despair, or that feeling of why me, why was he taken from me? Like that would in a weird way be kind of a repudiation of your life. You would want the memory of you to bring happiness.
Yeah.
And I like the logic of that is such a Stoic way of thinking about it. But I think about that all the time. How would they want you to feel when you think of them?
To think of them, exactly.
And sadness is not even on the list of top 10 emotions that I would want my kids to think about if I was gone.
Exactly. Grief is something that we don't necessarily deal with very well. And people often say, you've got to get over it, you've got to move on, you've got to get to the next phase, whereas actually often you're permanently changed. Sure. And it's one of the things I loved about Queen Victoria. She continues to be criticised to this day because she grieved. So she was very melodramatic in her grief and it went on for a very long time and she didn't appear in public. But I like how spectacularly she insisted on her right to grieve.
Yeah.
Thereby enabling a whole other bunch of women in her times who also were widows and were used to then being just, put out in the back parlour.
Yeah.
Your time as a functional human was over and she insisted it wasn't. But I've been thinking a lot about one thing that my mother said to me, which was that when I was a kid, which was if anything ever happens to me and I have and you've just said something you regret or done something or haven't done something and I want you to know I forgive you and I love you.
Wow.
And
what a gift.
That's such a gift because I think a lot of people, when they think about someone they've lost, they wish they've done more or they'd been more or they hadn't said something. And I think it's really important to release each other from that and go fundamentally. I've said this to my kids again recently. They're like, yep, okay. But it's important I think that's really important to hold on to. Something I've been thinking about lately is last moments. Mm-hmm. There was a column in the New York Times about could this be the last, about growing older and should you grow older gracefully or disgracefully and, the same old things, enjoy every moment and so on. And someone wrote in and it was this really poignant, beautiful thing because she said that she was coming back and she'd spent the day minding her grandkids and her grandkids, she'd been making Play-Doh with them and she got home at the end of the day and took her shoes off and in the tread was pushed this Play-Doh. And she was like, that's so annoying. I remember how that used to be with my kids. And then she paused and was like, well, actually, how long will these little ones want me to make Play-Doh with them? And when was the last time I'll actually be able to do that?
Yeah.
And just to have joy in that. And it got me thinking about kind of the last time we ever kind of say or do something. And Elizabeth Strout wrote about it in Lucy by the Sea. The last time you pick up your kid.
Yes.
When is that? Mm-hmm. And then, but the more you think about it, every day is full of those last times.
Yeah. No, someone was pointing out to me that there's something wonderful about watching your kids grow up, but there's also this grief because as great as my, 7-year-old going on 8-year-old is, the 6-year-old version of him is gone.
Right.
And the 5-year-old version is gone.
Yeah.
And since he has a younger brother who's a little more than 2 years younger, you're reminded constantly of that person that's gone also. Mm-hmm. And so there is this kind of perpetual grief. There's a brilliant poem about how the seasons, we think of the new season coming and how wonderful it is, the flowers or the whatever, but you're not thinking of the winter that's gone forever.
Right.
And that there is kind of a sadness of the changing of seasons there too. If you're not paying attention. So whenever I'm clipping their nails or I take them for a haircut or their clothes don't fit, I think of what that is an illustration of is the passage of time that never comes back.
Yeah. I was trying to think, when was the last time I picked up my kids? So he's 15. I got 2 kids, but my son is 15, and he used to really just love to hold on to me as I did housework. Yeah. He was just like a little koala, and he had this morning dance. He was such a morning person. He'd be like, morning dance, morning. And I was like, I'm not a morning person, so it was always amusing to me. And today he's on school holidays and he was out. There's shaving cream in the bathroom. He was running a bath and he was eating fried chicken in the bath and watching Netflix.
Yeah.
And he was calling out to me like this. He was like, Mom. I was like, dude, your voice. And it's just a long way from the morning dance,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just the absurdity and the insanity of it.
Yeah, who is this creature who's constantly growing, but how great.
Jeannie Gaffigan, she's the wife of the comedian Jim Gaffigan. She was talking about the Play-Doh thing. She was saying that, you may have just missed it. Did your kids play with slime?
Oh, yes.
She was like, she ends up getting a brain tumor and she thinks she might die. And she was realizing that she spent all her time, she says, engaging in control of the slime, not in playing with the slime. Right. So, it's like, hey, no, you can't play with this on the table. It has to be in a thing. No, you're going to get it on the floor. Like you spend all the energy trying to put up guardrails and boundaries to keep the house clean.
There's a reason for that, man. That slime
it's
sucks.
Disgusting. It's the worst. But what you're missing and what we're so prone to do as adults is just completely slide over the fact that they think this is the most fun and wonderful thing in the world. Like we don't get the joy of it at all. It makes no sense to me. I find it disgusting. The smell is weird, but clearly for them, it's
so fun.
It's beyond fun.
Yeah.
And so but instead of trying to understand why it's so fun, our impulse is to corral the fun.
Yeah.
And to suppress the fun.
Yeah. Well, but then I'll get an image of, what's the Dr. Seuss thing when the kids just go feral in the house?
That's just every day at my house.
Yeah, exactly. It's true though. Maybe slime outside and we should
then
all
it's
play.
like, hey, let's put glitter in the slime. And then it's, it's obviously it's fun because the consequences are not falling on them. But you're focusing on the consequences, and what you're not thinking about is that at some point it's going to hit you as you go to throw away the slime from the play closet or whatever.
Totally.
That they don't do this anymore. Yeah. And that will make you sad.
Yeah. Being a parent, hey?
Yeah. No, it's funny. I think one thing that's all share in common, another story I added into the obstacles away. There's this story about Hemingway. He's in Europe with his wife, and she goes to meet him. She brings all of his writings. He has this meeting with an editor, and she leaves it like on a train. She loses everything that he's worked on, like his whole back catalog.
Oh my gosh.
And he's writing a letter to Ezra Pound after, and he says, look, I know what you're going to tell me, which is that this is for the best and it's going to force me to change and redo it all better. And he says, I know, but I'm not there yet.
Yeah, right. Give me some time.
Yeah. And I think it's that way with grief. It's that way with, experiences with your kids. The clarity of it will hit you in retrospect, but it's in the moment. If you can give yourself some of the insight that later you're going to have, like later you're going to look back at this and see this as a formative moment. Yeah. Later you're going to look back at this as a wonderful childhood memory.
Yeah.
But right now all you're thinking about is you're tired or you don't want to clean it up, or that it's so unfair or that it's so painful. Yeah. So the faster you can get there, the better.
Yeah. I love the last moments idea though.
Yes. Yeah. How will you think about this if this was it's a way of forcing yourself to get out of the moment and get perspective about the moment, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And not just wish them away because you're tired and they want yet another book.
Yes.
You know that thing you sometimes do with a book and then you double the pages? cheat.
Yes, of
so
course.
you read it more quickly. Just I think you've just got to soak all that up.
Yeah, no, you rush through bedtime, and then one night they go, all right, good night.
Yeah.
And then you're like, wait, we're not doing the whole thing?
Yeah.
And it's gone forever. And then in that moment, you will feel a profound sadness, and you will wonder what the fuck you rushed through those other ones for.
Yeah.
So you could answer emails or watch something on Netflix. Like when I think about that impulse of let's speed this along, how rarely is it ever for their benefit? I tell myself, you have to go to bed. You know what you're gonna. It's not like they have a presidential debate the next morning. You know, they could be tired the next morning. Who cares?
Right,
like none of it matters. But so what is it that I feel like I'm having to rush through to go do? And it never ages well. Whatever the thing was, it never ages well.
Exactly.
It was like, oh, there was something on the counter that I wanted to eat. You know? or it's like there's something I wanted to watch. Yeah. There was a phone call I was going to make. It's never important.
Right.
And then you're rushing through a thing that you never get back.
And now I'm getting, I have to remind them to say goodnight.
Yeah.
Because they like to go in and like do their own thing.
There's a passage in Meditations where Marcus Aurelius says, you know, when you tuck your child in at night, you should say to yourself, they will not survive till the morning. And this is a man who buried 6 children. So I don't think he's saying this glibly. And I don't think he's trying to practice some kind of monkish philosophical detachment from his child. I think he's trying to say, you only get so many of these. Why are you, if you knew this was the last time you were going to do it, how would you do it?
Exactly.
And it would not be to skip some of the pages in the book.
Yeah.
It would not be to come on. Right. You know? Like I try to go like, he wants me to get him something. That's wonderful. You know what like I am getting it for him because I love them.
Yeah.
And they are giving me a chance to do it again.
Yeah.
Or, you know, you get them down and you sneak out of the room and you're like, oh. And then you hear
tap, 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 tap.
And you're like, there's the first impulse is, God damn it, you know? And then the second impulse, I try to will myself to say, I get to do it again.
Yeah. Exactly.
I'd still prefer to go to sleep, but I get to do it again.
Yeah.
You know, and there's something about that.
I think there's a reason why the Go the Fuck to Sleep was such a big hit. And they always come back out when I'm in the middle of a snack that I probably shouldn't be having.
Yes.
Like their Halloween candy or something, you know.
Yeah, yeah. What? You know?
Yeah. They're like, I knew you did that. You put me to sleep and you sit up here and eat ice cream. Yes, I do. That is right. But,
so I feel like that gift your mother gave you of saying, hey, like I forgive you, don't feel all, that's in a way the definition of grace.
Exactly. Because she very naturally, you know, you see the best in people and you place the love first and you never exploit a weakness as opposed to, I knew you never, valued me. I knew you never recognized this, that, and the other. Like, you know, a lot of people get vindictive at the point of death. So to be able to say, you know what, there's just so much love there, take that.
Yeah.
And keep going.
What drove you to write about grace?
I think 2 things. Firstly was my experience of grace through her because it was something she really believed in. And I saw that what she did and the way she was with so many people kind of really could transform lives and change people. And I still have people kind of coming up to me and talking about it and what she did, the idea of like forgiveness when you really just seems impossible and actually absurd.
Yeah.
Loving people who are just complete jerks. Like she'd always be like, I'd be like, oh man, what do I do about this person at work? Like someone who's really undermining me and treating me like they were just like crap, passive aggressive or aggressive or whatever. And she'd be like, just try to like love them. I'm like, Mum, are you serious right now? So, but she was it's the sense of like, it seems implausible. It's so far beyond eye for an eye.
Yeah.
But then what would it do to people if you do that? When in cases when you show mercy.
Yeah.
not merit. And when you do things for people who don't necessarily deserve it. And I think that's so crucial and wild. And it's not to say you shouldn't have any boundaries.
Sure.
And maybe we'll get to forgiveness, but it's not to say that you allow anyone to do anything and it's a whole culture of impunity. But the other reason, that forgiveness can be astonishing. So the other reason I want to write about it is because I've written and thought so much about awe.
Yeah.
And I know this is something you think about too, but it's, that sense of feeling small in the natural world, how psychologically healthy that is.
Yeah.
That sense of being overcome, overwhelmed, like struck by something and realizing that there's a great, massive, marvelous universe well beyond us. Just how psychologically healthy that is and how that had really kept me strong through some of the darkest times of my life. And there's Dacher Keltner from the University of California who's written about awe, and he's done a lot of studies over the years. Did a study recently of about 2,600 people across 26 countries to find out what was the most common experience of awe. And you would imagine, what would you have said if it was?
I don't know, a mountain or, some natural phenomenon, the Grand Canyon kind of thing.
Yeah, that's what I would say too. And so across all kind of histories, demographics, cultures, dialects, whatever, he found that the most common experience of it was actually seeing it in another person, in another human being, acts of moral beauty, of great courage, generosity, decency, people overcoming obstacles and hurdles, people overcoming things in life. And I was really struck by that, and I wanted to explore it. What does that actually look like when you do something that someone else doesn't deserve? What impact does it have on you? What does it have on them? What does it mean for people witnessing it?
Yeah.
And to me, it's the very best of who we are.
I was just thinking about that when I was reading this Lincoln book, because there's this story. Lincoln's a sort of an up-and-coming lawyer, gets chosen to be on this case. It's the biggest case of his life.
Yeah.
And it ends up changing venues. And so the company, it's a big company, they bring on another lawyer. Yeah. And that lawyer sees Lincoln as this country bumpkin, basically kicks him off the case. He still gets paid, but he kicks him off the case. He calls him like a gorilla to his face. He just sees him as just a buffoon.
Yeah.
And every night, Lincoln decides to attend the trial anyway. He wants to learn from it. Every night, all the lawyers meet in the hotel lobby to discuss the case. They never include Lincoln. It's like the humiliation of his career.
Right.
And, a decade and a half later, that lawyer is who Lincoln chooses as his Secretary of War.
Huh.
And the right man at the right time. And when I think of things that strike me with awe, it's not these brilliant works of art. It's not, somebody did this athletic feat that I can't imagine. It's the sense of self and the empathy and the forgiveness to be like, this person who humiliated me, who treated me like absolute garbage, is the right man for this thing, and I won't get in their way. Not only will I not get in their way, I will be their advocate. When you think of when you think of Gandhi or you think of Jesus on the cross, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Moments of that sort of almost superhuman grace is one of the most incredible and powerful forces in existence.
And it changes everyone who witnesses it.
Yes.
Any of the scientific studies I've seen into that just show people are much more likely to do it themselves. And a lot of those studies are on moral elevation in workforces. And if you see and find out, not in a way that trumpets it, hey, guess what, guys, I'm a great philanthropist, here's my name across some wall. But when you find out that someone in a position of leadership has been, quietly sacrificing time or money or caring for someone in a way they didn't necessarily need to, that can really shift a whole culture of a company.
Yes. Yeah, when you are the angel that a person needs in a scenario. Yeah. And it in many cases was not only difficult, but it wasn't in your interest. There's something absolutely incredible about that.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because a lot of people see grace as something nice and about being polite and not quite a Hallmark card, but something kind of pretty and easy. And it is.
Everyone appreciates it, celebrates it as it's happening.
It's lovely.
Yes.
It's like puppies and Kleenex tissues, right? But this is about something that's really hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, forgiving people can be incredibly hard to do, and you don't just do it once. You sometimes have to just do it every single day.
Yes.
You know, and sometimes it's at cost to yourself.
Right. How many times should I forgive my brother? 7 times? No. 70 times? No. 70 times 7.
Yeah, exactly.
And just the incredibleness of that.
Yeah.
It's probably, I think, that is the greatest concept of Christianity, that grace and forgiveness.
And at the heart of that is grace is done nothing. You've done nothing to deserve it.
Yes. Well, the idea that, to me, my understanding of Christianity is basically this idea of you were forgiven for everything.
Yep.
And so you were given a gift.
Yes, that's
which
right.
means that you in turn have to give.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
that sort of obligation or that indebtedness, like you're a shitty person, you've done shitty things. So the idea that you get to hold that above someone else, that you get to hold something over someone else for having made a mistake or done you wrong or done the world wrong.
You owe me, buddy.
That's a luxury that you're actually not entitled to.
Yeah. Which is amazing.
Yes.
And it doesn't actually make sense. You know, and look, I have grown up as we talked about with my mother, who talked a lot about forgiveness, grown up like really being exposed to the idea that you forgive and forgive and forgive. Then as a reporter, I've done a lot of work on domestic abuse and violence and sexual assault. And I also looked at domestic violence in faith communities and could see how that was weaponized by abusers. And sometimes by like structures to tell women especially, don't leave, just put up with it, you forgive again and again and again. And that's where I think we need to be cautious, that forgiveness doesn't mean, okay, I don't need to protect myself now, or I don't need to move away from you. Forgiveness can sometimes be cutting ties and walking away from.
Well, first off, it's the idea that you have competing and sometimes conflicting obligations to yourself, to your children.
That's right.
To the person that comes after you. But also I think as I just did this book on justice and I think it's been helpful for me to understand the justice system is something apart from and separate that is a societal invention that is required for us all to live together and function in a large group. And then our personal sense of justice is something very different. So you forgiving the person is not mutually exclusive with them being held accountable for that thing. And them being held accountable and how they're held accountable and the whole system built around it is based on the statistics and, you know, the experience and what society understands has to happen to protect future generations and to deter other people, et cetera. That's very different than what you as the individual ought to do.
That is really important. It is not separate to justice. It is not separate to the consequences of justice. And it is very much about what you need as an individual. I got really interested in restorative justice when I was writing this book. And the idea being that you bring together, as you'd be familiar, you bring together the person the harm's been caused to, the person that caused the harm. You have a mediator who's very experienced, who spent a year working out whether these people can get together. And basically it's the victims who are really asking for these kinds of justice systems because they often go through a court. They've never even had to give a victim impact statement or they want to talk directly to the person that caused them harm. But again, there needs to be remorse and you can't have any expectation of forgiveness. Yeah. So sometimes they want to know just a piece of information. Sometimes they want to know what are the last words my daughter said before she died. What are they? So this kind of complicated but really quite amazing process actually, because when it works, when you have these two people staring at each other, trying to recognize harm caused and each other's humanity, it can allow for the possibility of redemption, but it also can really free the victim. And there was one woman I spoke to called Debbie McGrath, and her brother was killed when she was 24, he was 20, and it was killed by a friend who just shot him one night after they'd been playing at the pub and killed him. No explanation has ever been given. And she found herself, she was then heavily pregnant, consumed with rage about this. Sure. She was so furious about it, that consumed in a way that it took over her mind, it took over her body. She put on a lot of weight. She got diabetes. She got insomnia. Her father got very ill. It just infected this whole community as these incidents and attacks and horrible things often do. she told me that she was at a point where she would like look at a sunset and she would see, she would be thinking about ways to murder this guy. Right. Like it was just so, she couldn't free herself from it. And one day she sat down opposite him, finally in a restorative justice moment, and she just was able to say to him, this is what you did to me.
Yeah.
This is what happened to my body. This is what happened to my mind. This is what you did to my father. This is what you did to my brother's son who never had a dad growing up. And she said there was a point at which during this that she sat up, and because she instinctively, because she felt like something had been lifted from her,
yeah.
and she just looked around and realised it just felt that way. And she said that she had put everything that he did to her in a suitcase and left it at his feet, and it was his. And after that, she was freed. Yeah. She goes, I don't know if that was forgiveness. I don't know what it was, but I now, her worst fear was that she wouldn't be able to love again because love for her was associated with loss. And she had grandkids, and now she said to me, I can love my grandson. And like that, moments like that.
Well, because I was struck you have the sort of the land acknowledgement at the beginning of the book. And that's a thing I've seen all over Australia. That's not really an American thing. No. We're very much in denial of our past.
Yeah.
And it's not just a singular denial, but a sort of an ongoing perpetuation of that denial. And I was so I was struck by the choice. What does that mean to you? How does that connect to grace?
So it's an acknowledgement that right now we are on the land owned by the Eora people, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which was not ours and which belonged to First Nations people before we came.
Yeah.
And we've had a horrible and difficult history that it's taken us as a country a long time to reckon with.
Yeah.
The massacres, the poisoning, the dispossession, the stolen generations. And I spoke to quite a few members of the stolen generations for my book, being taken away from your families and being told that that you basically have to be white. You speak your own language, you'll have your mouth washed out with soap or with poison, with cleaning detergent. You like stripped of all of your identity, of your family, of your culture, of your language, and they were supposed to be trained usually to do domestic work. And the trauma that goes on from that generation to generation that we're still living with today. What happened, the fact that so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people came together as elders and said, we want to have a makarata, coming together after a period of struggle and walking together to a better future. To me, the grace in that is astonishing.
Yes.
And undeserved. So we have a National Sorry Day, which is a day which recognised the first report into bringing them home into the stolen generations. And a former Prime Minister a few years ago said, okay, it's one thing to say sorry, but what you guys really need to do is forgive. That's the really hard thing. That's the really important thing here. And their response of a lot of elders was, get in the bin. Like, you can't have a powerful white man telling us, literally as the Prime Minister, that the onus is on us to forgive.
Yeah.
That's our burden.
You owe me.
Yeah, when you haven't done anything really to fix it.
Sure.
And so that was a big issue in coming up to the Voice vote, which we had at the end of last year, which was about whether we had a Indigenous voice to Parliament, just an advisory group that would advise the Parliament on what each bit of legislation would mean for First Nations people.
Yeah, there's one of those long German words that I won't bother to pronounce, but it means something like wrestling with the past. And have you seen that art? There's an art project in Germany, and I guess it's all over Europe, the stumbling stones.
Yes.
The sort of the raised reminders. And so on the one hand, I think about that a lot because they're annoying. They can hurt you, right? But that's the point. The point is that your inclination is to smooth things over, to pretend it didn't happen, to pretend you didn't come from people who did things like that, or just to even pretend that people can do things like that.
Yeah.
And obviously denying or acknowledging the past, it doesn't change whether it happened. It happened. but it's in the acknowledging and the process, these things that maybe seem sort of empty or performative. You're going to acknowledge this before a performance. Before the meeting, we're going to acknowledge the land we're on, or a state's in America going to apologize for slavery. Or we're going to teach these. It can seem performative and meaningless, but it's not about the past at all. It's about the reminder and the understanding of what people can do at their worst, so you don't do it again. So you can be changed in the future. Right? That's at least how I see it. And so there's something obviously powerful about grace, but there's also something powerful, I think, about taking responsibility and staring truth in the face, because it's a gift. That's all, as painful and as much of a stumble as that can cause. It's also an incredible gift, because it's allowing you to learn,
right,
and to grow and to not repeat these monstrous acts.
Because you can't. You prevent yourself from repeating if you don't acknowledge what happened.
Exactly. And you're more likely to, if you're in denial of it, that's how you do it again.
And it's always puzzled me as a historian, and you must be the same as well, when people say, oh, how can you bring that up? That's so negative. You know what I mean? Why? You're like, it's history. Yes. It happened. It either happened or it didn't.
Yeah, I heard a historian say, you don't have guilt, but you have responsibility.
Right.
And that distinction. So there's nothing to feel shame about, because you didn't do it. Like my ancestors weren't even here when this happened, right? Yeah. But I do reap the benefits of what certain people did.
Exactly.
My grandmother went to a segregated school in Arkansas, like Little Rock High School. My grandmother went to that school while it was segregated. It's 8-year-old. She didn't choose any of this. Her parents maybe did, but that confers benefits to her, to my father, and then to me, in a way that, had it gone differently, or if I had been a different race, I wouldn't have have gotten those same benefits. But so acknowledging this, which obviously no one in my family ever talked about, right? It's a thing I discovered on accident.
Wow.
But acknowledging it doesn't change whether it happened or didn't happen. It doesn't make me guilty, or I don't have to do a sentence about it, but it does allow me to understand the present better. And it helps me understand what the right side of issues are, because I have an awareness and an understanding. And again, it's not a shame, but it is a reminder of, at that moment, there was a choice, this way or that way, and they went the wrong way. Yeah. And now, in my own choices, am I going to go the right way or the wrong way?
I think the shame is more in concealing.
Yes.
And as opposed to acknowledging and recognizing it happened. I mean, you speak about smoothing over, like, to me, because I was really wrestling with what is grace, and so many times I know that it is about us smoothing over and making things easy for people, and often it's gendered, and that's something that women should do, and we should all just let's just move on. And actually, I see grace as a slightly more ferocious iteration of that, because I see it knitted with justice, in the sense that it's a reminder that we can be better, and we can do better, and if we don't hold on to that, then how do we go forward? When
you quote Amazing Grace in the that's the epigraph of the book, right? Yeah. And like, just reading about, I'm forgetting the name of the man who wrote that song, but he was a slave trader.
Yeah.
And you think about who became an abolitionist.
Yes.
And so there's also this element of, which I think we're wrestling with as a society. I think, look, a lot of the complaints about cancel culture and are totally overblown. But when you write people off as irredeemable or incapable of change or improvement, you're also making a fatal mistake, because you see how many good things formerly or in largely bad people went on to do. And there's something there's something very fitting about the person who writes Amazing Grace being in such desperate need of said grace. The ultimate kind of grace.
Exactly. And I think so many interesting things about that song, because I found a lot during my research, and I found another occasion yesterday. There was a police officer killed in America, and another policeman at his funeral sang that, and he changed some of the words to talk about policemen dying. And I found that in times in history when people don't know what to say, they will sing that.
Yeah.
So my book is called Bright Shining, from the line in Amazing Grace, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining like the sun. because I see grace as being very much like the sun. That line wasn't there from Isaac Newton. That line was there from was put in by Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Really?
That was the first time it was recorded because it had been a spiritual.
Yeah.
It had been sung by African Americans and was very much linked to abolitionism at that time. Yeah. And then it became an anthem of the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. So when Obama stood at that funeral of Reverend Pinckney, there'd been another mass shooting, and he said that he couldn't quite bear to. He says this in his podcast with Bruce Springsteen, Renegades, that after Sandy Hook, he's like, "What do I have even to say anymore? Mm-hmm. If we don't do anything when 26-year-olds are gunned down." And he'd been corresponding with Marilyn Robinson about grace, and grace being the extraordinary kind of goodness that goes beyond the everyday. And he pauses and he just sings it.
Yeah.
And it's so, you'll remember that. It was so powerful because you could see people stand around him. You could see their faces change. Some are weeping, some are being more joyful. But at that moment, he's telling them that we have to hold on to what is good, because we can be and do better, and because if we lose sight of that, then it's the darkness.
Yes.
And I know he's been a man that's kind of very about hope, and he said that after Sandy Hook, that was the closest he ever came to kind of losing hope. I'm sure he might have been tested a bit recently as well. But I just found that moment really staggering, because I think we ache and yearn for those moments.
We do, and what's so hard about them is, as beautiful and as moving as that moment was, though everyone's on the same page about this.
Yeah.
There's a huge chunk of the country that I'm from that's not on the same page.
Yeah.
That basically sees that same thing and says, like, that is sad.
Right.
That is bad.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to do one fucking thing about it.
Yeah.
And so how do you maintain that good, or that sense of I think we saw this during the pandemic too, where you go, people are doing and saying like just monstrous things, just the sort of prevalence of cruelty. I think in America, you're seeing a version of Christianity that has been stripped of all the grace and obligations and love. You're basically seeing Christianity stripped of love, and it becomes sort of a fundamentalist.
You know what else I'm saying? I actually realised this watching the RNC, is that there was a long time there when, I'm going to guess around the 2000s, when evangelical Christianity in the States was really looking for hyper-masculine kind of bros and charismatic figures to lead them and talk in a certain way. And it was that whole thing about, don't make Jesus some like soft dude. He's more like John Wayne. Sure. And he's more. And when I was watching the convention, I was like, oh, that has actually combined.
Yes.
Yeah. With the vision that those people around
the
Trump
only time Jesus gets mad in the Bible is at the money changers.
Turning over that, yeah.
The only people he doesn't like are selfish rich people, and somehow, somehow you get an inversion of Christianity. I mean, it's starting to get extreme, but I think there's an argument that this version of Christianity is closer to being one that like the Antichrist would have asked for than the actual Christianity of Jesus, which is about love and compassion and forgiveness and grace. And you see what a hollow, empty thing it becomes when it's stripped of that, because it becomes a mechanism of control and domination and power and othering and who's entitled to heaven and who's not, who's the sinner and who's not.
Exclusion.
Yeah. And it's and so how do you I think what I struggle with is how do you have compassion for people who are in the sway of that, right? Like if we think about grace as being this thing that's so important, and then you watch people acting without grace, trying to not, like I was saying recently, like the main struggle of our time is to not let the assholes turn you into an asshole, or
that is a big struggle, totally.
That's
because
the
that's the wisdom
that
that's what will win.
Yeah, like
we're actually taught now that assholery will triumph.
Yes.
And it's like, when do we talk about better angels? Or as one of our prime ministers here, Paul Keating, used to say, we need to pull on the golden threads in the community. Like, which leader is doing that? Pulling on golden threads.
Yes.
On how we can be better or love better. I think it's important to, though, step inside, just step into other people's shoes. Yes. I think we're seeing a lot of bizarre behaviour from some Christian groups who are seeing Donald Trump more as a kind of, as a martyr, but an anti-hero, actually. So he doesn't have to be perfect. He can be all these other things.
Look, if you watched a lot of cable news, it would not be good for you. And then if you watched specifically a certain kind of cable news that basically just lied to you all the time.
Yeah.
Australia's worst export.
You're welcome.
Yeah. It would destroy your brain.
Yeah, and you feel persecuted. I mean, there's a lot of very legitimate things people are feeling like. Look at what happened after the global financial crisis. Look at who's really the hollowing out of the middle class, inflation, poverty. There's so many, the housing crisis. But you're right. I mean, it's the loss of truth in the middle of all of that. But I think when I was watching the Republican National Convention and I was seeing people like Franklin Graham up there, and I was hearing people talk about that Trump has been saved by God and by the grace of God and he will get them through. There's a lot of people who feel that they've been diminished or overlooked or sidelined, or the number of people going to church is going down. They feel kind of very persecuted. And so it's a return to a more combative and fundamentalist form of faith, which is whereas I actually think a lot of people respond most positively to faith that they see in action. Mm-hmm. That's what polls here show in terms of caring or looking after people or sacrificing.
Well, I do think, we were talking about history earlier. I think that a lot of progress has been made in sort of showing what actually happened historically and not the sort of propaganda, mythological version of history. At the same time, what we've also done for generations now is strip people of those inspiring examples. Yeah. That, as you said, when you hear, you're like, they did this. When you think of Cincinnatus, he's made dictator of Rome, he saves Rome, and then he returns to his farm. He lays down the power. The power of that example is what inspires George Washington to resign his commission, to leave after 2 terms of the 200 plus years of peaceful transitions of power in America come because of an ancient story of a guy who probably didn't actually even exist. But the power of that story told through the generations is a moment of sort of profound inspiration and meaning. And so, what do you do when you have a society that can't choose heroes or examples to celebrate and hold up to reinforce these lessons of what actually should fill us with awe and inspiration? You're and then you put on top of that, you have a media culture that it's constantly talking about the worst people doing the worst things. Yeah. It becomes a very wicked feedback loop that I'm not sure you can pull out of very easily.
Yeah, Brett Goldstein. Did you watch Ted Lasso?
Of course.
So Roy Kent.
Yeah.
He's here. He's there. Yeah. The actor who played him went and saw this movie one time, and I think it was a really grueling assault of some sort. Found it horrific. He came out of it feeling like he'd been run over by a truck, says to his friend, that's entertainment, but what? And then he's thought about it and he said, he really felt that was like bad art, because even in the middle of anything horrific, you speak to survivors, you speak to people who've had terrible diagnoses, you read their accounts, you read history, and you'll know that even in the most awful and challenging of circumstances, there'll always be a moment of connection. Yeah. There'll always be a moment when people put their arms around each other. There'll be a moment of humor. And if you haven't seen that, then you haven't observed life.
Yeah.
And it's also about the stories that we tell, as you're saying, so COVID, so many people behave so weirdly.
Yes.
And are still as a consequence of that.
Yeah.
Here, neighbours, dobbing in neighbours for doing, saying that they're having too many people over, or they're like whatever. It brought out a lot of smallness. But then we have these 2 women who I talk about in the book from Sao Paulo, Brazil, who and it was just rampant, COVID running through the country at that stage, and the health system was overwhelmed, and the wards were all packed, and they didn't have enough supplies. But one thing they found really, really grueling was the fact that when people were there and they were ill or they were dying, they couldn't have their loved ones with them. I remember how bad that was. And a lot of nurses found that quite heartbreaking. And there were these two women, and who were nurses, and they went out in their lunch break and were talking about this. And they were like, what about that old technique we heard about one time in medical school? And they came back and they got 2 gloves, those rubber gloves that you get in hospitals, filled them with like really warm water, knotted them together. So it was like one hand, and put them over people's hands. So it was like one warm hand on the top, one warm hand on the bottom. And they found that had an immediate impact on people's vitals, on their oxygen levels, on the perfusion, and they repeated it in other hospitals and they had the same things. And it's a situation of like, when I tracked them down, they said they were so amazed by the physical impact of it. But, these are bits of rubber filled with water.
Sure. No,
but it's also a way a stranger is loving another person.
I think about that woman, Dr. Catalin Carrico, the one whose research on mRNA is what basically unlocks the vaccine that saves hundreds of thousands, millions of lives. I mean, she's a Hungarian immigrant fleeing communism. She ends up in America in the 80s. She never makes more than like $40,000 or $50,000 a year. Her husband manages an apartment complex as like a superintendent. And she's repeatedly passed over for promotions. She has to constantly reapply for her job. She never has tenure, but she just like chugs away at this little bit of research that was fascinating to her that she thought had potential.
Something.
And then, she changes the world with it. And the examples of people who did amazing things in the teeth of incredible adversity or discrimination or doubt, we don't have the stories we need to make people think, oh, that's what human beings are capable. We're constantly reminded of the horrible, selfish, stupid, ignorant things that humans are capable of, and not enough of like sort of true human greatness.
I did find when writing this that people would struggle. When I'd say to them, when was the last time you saw an act of grace in the public? A lot of people really struggled with that. They would talk about Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, who was, after they had a mass shooting there, was just very inclusive, wore a hijab, was just very spoke of real unity at a time that she could have really politically capitalized on it, which I think was people spoke
about. The choice between dark energy and light energy is a choice that we don't often acknowledge as a choice. Yeah. And then we don't often celebrate the cost that it takes to make the right choice.
Yeah. And how you have to sometimes repeatedly make it.
Yeah.
When they go low, we go high is a great example. When you look back to the way John McCain was, and you see people interrupting him when he was running for president saying, I know that, Barack Obama's an Arab and a terrorist. He's, no, ma'am. He cares about this country,
Or an incredible moment of grace. I mean, he could have left the Hanoi Hilton. He's in there with Stockdale. So his father is the theater commander of all naval operations in that part area of the world during the war. And so when the prison guards discover that they have his son, obviously one option, they could have tortured him even worse or killed him. But they decide that the most insidious, disruptive thing they could do would be to give him preferential treatment as a way to demoralize the country and all the soldiers. And so basically they offer him a chance to leave. And the rule is it's supposed to be first in, first out. So he wasn't in line to be released. Yeah. And so they say, you can skip the line. You can go home. We won't torture anymore. You can go home. And he chooses to stay. He says, no, I want the regular rules to apply to me. And so, those sort of moments of superhuman strength and character, and the decision to say, why should I be exempted from the rules? Why should I get preferential treatment? Is just we, as a society, we celebrated kind of the manliness of he endured the torture and survived. And we actually missed the truly profound bit of human greatness in that story, which was the sense of honor and fairness and integrity that he's stuck with when it cost him. I mean, he basically loses the use of his arm for the rest of his life. Probably had demons the rest of his life. Yeah. And you think about what that cost him, but that's what that sort of culture is supposed to inculcate.
Don't you find when I hear stories like that, like I just feel such relief?
Yeah. Right? Not all is lost.
Yeah. Like people like this exist in the world.
Yeah.
I honestly think we hunger for that.
Well, you quote The Road in the intro of the book, and that idea of carrying the fire is to me one of the most beautiful memoirs ever, or beautiful metaphors ever to exist in fiction. This idea of carrying the fire, and that's what those are reminders that the fire is not out. I think that it remains lit, and that's your sort of primary job as a human being.
Carry the fire.
Yeah, and to pass it along to your children.
But I think once you start to think about it, even though we're seeing this real paucity of it in the public realm, you see it in people around you all the time.
Sure.
Like, and I don't mean that in a glib way. I mean in hospitals when you're completely desperate. You can see some of our medical staff working under absolutely horrendous conditions, long hours, completely exhausted. And there's those moments of like tenderness which can blow you away.
Public school teachers,
people who work with people with disabilities, aged care homes, and like blood donors. I had a whole section on blood donors because the more I thought about it, the more it kind of amazes me that you can devote your life. And I spoke to a bunch of super donors. They've been doing it for like 50 years, and every 2 weeks, and when they go on holidays and all around the US and stuff when they're on holidays, they go and have a stranger put a needle in their arm and ask them a bunch of intrusive questions and have their actual blood drawn out, and they don't know who it's going to. Yeah. It could go to someone who votes in a way that they find completely abhorrent.
Could go to a convict.
Whose fashion sense is dreadful. Yeah. Who loves reality TV. Who, I don't know, whatever it is, you just define what a good person is. Could go to a complete jerk, but you know there's a human who has a need, and they need to be able to walk or to live a little longer. And I find that actually incredibly profound.
No, I read this article about someone who gave their kidney to a stranger. And I was talking to my wife about that. I was like, I would love to do that. That would be amazing. And she was like, sure. But have you ever given blood before? And I was like, no. She was like, why don't you just start there? Yeah. And it's a very small thing. I've done it ever since we had that conversation. I've done it every 2 months. Oh, yeah. And it takes 30 minutes. Yeah. And it's an amazing thing.
Yeah.
And you feel literally your life force leaving your body. And you have this sense that it's going into someone who needs it at an incredibly vulnerable.
And I've had it. I've had a lot of blood transfusions. And I remember my very first one I was so drained and exhausted. And if you've never had one before, you're like, oh, wow, weird. And then it was fading. I remember this nurse was leaning into me. She was whispering into my ear, and she was just talking to me about writing and all the different things. Like it was like we're in this like little cocoon. She was so gentle and sweet, and kind of when it was coming through me, it was like I felt like life running through my veins. Yeah. And within a short period of time, you're like actually stronger. It's kind of magical.
It is. Yeah. There's like this little story. It goes viral on Facebook, and I guess before that it was probably in emails, but it's about that. I almost cry every time I hear it, even though I know it's not real. It's about the little boy whose sister is sick. And the doctor tells him that she needs a kidney transplant or a liver transplant or whatever. And they said it's gonna hurt. It's gonna take a long time, but she really needs it. And he says, okay. And they put him under. They do the operation, and then he wakes up, and then he just says, "So when do I die?"
Oh, that's so beautiful.
Yeah. And the idea that you can do just a minor version of that that costs you nothing. Mm-hmm. And the cost is like you have to drink water after how little it takes from you. It's almost giving blood almost feels like a problem they would have solved already. Like that there's not some synthetic chemical replacement, right. But no, actually they need human beings on a regular basis to go to a place and just put some of their blood in a bag in a bus. In the US, there are all these buses that pull up, and you go in the bus and you do it, and then the bus drives away. Yeah. And that they have to it's like guaranteed to save someone's life, right?
Yeah.
And they have to like pay you with like gift cards in the US to get people to do it. Do you know like
I think you just get a little cookie here.
In the US you get like a cookie or a gift card or something. But then it's like you think about you think what it would. I think everyone, especially men, probably have some fantasy of saving someone's life. There's a shooting or someone falls into a river and you have to save them, right? And you go, what would I do if I was, and
that's what you're doing.
Yeah, they call this moral luck. Like, would you ever be in a situation where you would be called to save someone from, train tracks or something?
Yeah.
And you probably won't be, but you're actually on a daily basis turning down the opportunity to do something like that.
It's really good for introverts as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
People who don't really want to go out on committees and go out like glad-handing people, they just quietly can serve in that way. Like it is a really beautiful form of altruism, I think. Having spent like quite a lot of time in the medical system, I do think that is where you can actually see so many acts of grace.
Mm-hmm.
You've got people who are broken, bunged up, completely vulnerable, just a bunch of busted humans in hospital beds, right? It doesn't matter who you are, what you've done, nothing.
Yeah.
That's what you are. You are down to your bones and your veins and your basic functions. And the way people will come in and care for you will kind of wipe down your body, will mop your brow, will give you a special hot blanket to be tucked in to try to give you hope, try to anticipate pain when they don't see it.
The American medical system is also the most wonderful embodiment of the idea of a melting pot that you can imagine.
Yes.
Because it's a profession that tends to pay well and doesn't require a ton of education, like at the sort of nursing level. I mean, obviously I'm not saying they're not educated. I'm just saying it's accessible. And so, if you're a racist, don't ever go to a hospital. Do you know what I mean? Like, totally. Because what you're forced to confront is just the full spectrum of the different types of people from every imaginable corner of the earth who now hold your life in their hands. And how wonderful that actually is as a metaphor and an example of like what society truly is.
Yeah. And it's not even, I agree with that, and it's exactly the same here. It's not even, though, just physically patching you up. Like the way that they can accompany you, or the quietest of gestures, or sometimes you have to break horrendous news to people. Or like it's a very raw and real place to be. And you'll often find patients who've had terrible news worrying most of all about the people around them. You'll often have them looking at the doctors. So cutting people slack when they can't get their friggin' catheter in right, because it always often takes so many goes after you've had big surgery. Yeah, so when I've sat in hospital beds or lain in hospital beds for long stretches of time, I've watched all of that around me.
Yeah.
And I have found it has been one of the things that has kept me going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to come back to Florence Nightingale, just Wellington described those soldiers as the scum of the earth, right? And here she is treating them as human beings, people worthy of saving, people who it was possible to save, who shouldn't have been written off as lost causes.
Yeah.
And you just think of the tangible impact of that work, both literally the lives saved and then the mechanisms and the systems that get set up. Like, I mean, just the profound impact that has, it ripples through the entire world.
Yeah.
And that comes because she has the courage to answer the call and to not let what other people think hold her back. That's what the second time she hears the voice, it says, are you going to let what other people think hold you back from my service? And she realized that's what she had been doing. She'd been letting her parents' opinions about what, a well-to-do daughter of a aristocratic family should be doing hold her back from saving people from suffering and death. And yeah, what an amazing way to spend your life.
she also just hated the waste of time that was involved in like her
sitting around. What am I supposed to do all day?
So, yeah, like that you just go to drawing room after drawing room, drop into people. And sure, that's a very privileged existence in so many ways for those times. But it was like she burned to work.
Yes.
That woman, she burned with a desire to go and help people.
One of the things in that book that I loved is, so on the one hand, her parents are idle and, you know, basically contribute nothing to society. But if you went back a generation or two, there'd been these sort of abolitionist ancestors and activist ancestors. And so I also loved the idea of like sort of deciding. Seneca has this great line. He says, we can't choose our parents, but we can choose whose children we would like to be. And she basically chooses which side of the family tree she's going to be descended from. You know, like, and so it doesn't really matter where you come from or what you did or what your parents did. You have this ability to like sort of choose whose footsteps you're going to follow in.
Yeah. And I love that idea.
Yeah.
So where do you see grace with Stoicism?
I mean, one of the things Marcus Aurelius talks about a lot is this idea of revenge. And, you know, he says the best revenge is to not be like that. The sort of penultimate moment in his life. So he's ill and near death, and his most trusted general, basically sensing that the emperor was weak, names himself emperor. So he starts a palace coup, and Marcus is not as sick as they thought, and he recovers. And so now he's faced with this terrible dilemma. There can't be two emperors, and this person has put everything into danger and turmoil. And so, I mean, we know what his predecessors would have done in this situation. Hadrian comes to power and just liquidates, you know, and Marcus decides not to do that. He can't ignore it. He can't just let this happen, but he decides, he says, this is an opportunity. He says, we can teach future generations there's a way to even deal with civil wars, which I just think is this amazing sort of way of thinking about it. And they go to restore order, and ultimately the other general, this guy named Avidius Cassius, is struck down by an assassin, and they bring Marcus Aurelius' head, and they think the emperor is going to be happy and reward them, and he breaks down in tears because they've stolen from him the opportunity for clemency. And so he sends this message to the Senate, and he says, not a single person is to be put to death for this rebellion. He says, do not stain my reign in blood. Let it never happen. And just this idea, like when Marcus really says the obstacle is the way, I think people have taken that, because that's how I wrote the first book. They've taken the obstacle as the way to mean, here's how you get ahead in business. Here's how you deal with these little disadvantages. You turn them into springboards. And that is part of it. But that famous passage in Meditations where he says, you know, the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes way. He's talking about other people. He's talking about frustrating, obnoxious, dishonest, evil people. He's saying that he says bad people are an opportunity to practice virtue. And so I think, to me, that's grace is only possible if there is first the thing you don't want to happen. You know, like if everyone was wonderful to each other and everything went perfectly, there would be no opportunity for grace. And so I think Stoicism would say that these things that you don't want to happen, these things that shouldn't happen, these things that are unfair to happen, these awful, dark, terrible things that human beings do to each other, the only good thing about them is who we can be in response to them. If we don't let them destroy our character and make us like the people that did the thing.
So it comes down to choices, as you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting. There's a man here, Danny Abdullah. He had 3 of his children and one of his nieces were out walking at night, and there was a driver who was intoxicated, I think drunk as well, these kids just went out to, they were all a bunch of primary school age kids, they went out to get an ice cream, and this driver ran them over and killed them all. And they decided quite quickly to forgive that guy. There was absolutely no reason to do that.
Yeah.
There'd been an incident before, not long before, in the western suburbs of Sydney, where a woman was dropping her kids at school, and she leaned down to get a water bottle, and then got from in the car and got the accelerator brake confused and went into the kindergarten and killed two children. And she was absolutely just bereft.
Sure.
And yet got a lot of attack from the school community. And there's footage of one of the parents, one of the children who was killed, and they're in the hearse, and his little green coffin is in the back, and the father has set up the camera on the dashboard and is saying, I don't want any hostility to this woman. She's a widow. She's got all these kids on her own. She's got kids at the school. They've got developmental disabilities. I want you to all know we forgive her. And it was such a touching thing, sure. And especially because we know that when the trial then came, the daughter testified and says, my mother wishes every day it was her that had gone, like that she had to live with this incredible burden.
Sure.
But when we look at the Abdullah family, it was like a guy that was being completely reckless and was fully responsible for what happened. But Danny, the father, says he has to get up every morning and make that decision. You don't just go, okay, we're all good now, you're fine.
Right.
It's still something that will torture you and you'll wrestle with, but you have to keep choosing to be the person that will forgive.
Well, and it's so easy to be glib about it. But I think the idea is like, does this person also get to steal your life from you?
Exactly.
And that's the Stoics would say, you don't control this horrendous tragedy that happened. You have no say over that, but you have some say over who you are today. And I like the idea of seeing it as this thing you do day to day. There's no magical insight or meditation or psychedelic you can take that could strip you from the anger and the grief and the pain that you feel. But I
want some if you find it, though.
Yeah. But you can choose in individual moments to have the moment or not have the moment. That's the one part we control.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this was amazing. Thank you.
It was so good to talk to you. You're like one of my favorite people to talk to.
Well, I love your books. And so they're very popular in our bookstore. So
are they?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I'll have to carry the new one. It's out this fall, right?
It's out just a month before the election. October 8. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.